In this section, we're going to be talking about modifying the layout of Photoshop and getting comfortable with the program. So let's get into it. The first thing that we want to do is go ahead and open up Photoshop. Now, depending on what version you have, it may look a little bit different, so don't worry about it. I'm going to make sure you're comfortable no matter what version you have. If you're on Creative Cloud, the first thing you want to know is that you're going to have this new welcome screen that doesn't exist if you're using CS6, CC 2014 or previous versions. But don't worry, we're going to get into that discussion in a bit as well. So the first thing we're going to do is open up a new document by hitting Command N or clicking this new button here. And for the time being, let's go ahead and hit OK. And we'll get into the topic of new documents and that going forward. Now, once we've opened up this document, you'll see that this layout should be familiar with no matter what version you're using. Now, on the right-hand side, you have these little boxes, and what this is known as is, they're called palettes. Palettes are basically things that help you modify an image. And we'll get into this discussion in a bit as well, and talking about in depth what they do, how they differ, and how we can use them to help us modify and edit our image as well. In the time being, on the left-hand side, you'll see this bar. This bar here are what is known as your tools. Tools basically help you edit an image like your brush, you have an eraser, things like that. On the right side, you have these boxes. The first thing that you want to do, no matter what version you're using, is you want to get accustomed to the layout and being able to modify your workspace. So these palettes right here are actually like Lego blocks. You can pull them apart, you can stack them. For example, this box here, which is called color, lets you pick the color of the paintbrush you're working with. So let's say we didn't want that. We can actually pick it apart, drag it over, and hit X. By default, Photoshop comes with a lot of these palettes already open. Most of them we don't even need, because when you're working with Photoshop, you have to keep in mind that a lot of graphic designers, photographers, retouchers, they all use Photoshop. But we don't all need the same tools. So just like any toolbox, we want to declutter the working space and just open up the ones that we want. So as you can see, I'm essentially just picking them off and closing them out. The other thing that we can do with them is we can stack them in groups. So we can take this history, for example, put them with properties, and you'll see them in tabs. Say we didn't want the whole group. We can go down to the menu and hit Close Tab Group. Now, there are a few things we do want open temporarily. One of them being layers. We don't want channels, so we'll go ahead and close that out as well. And we'll close paths. So let's go ahead and bring layers back. If you go under Window, you'll see that there are all of your palettes right in one column. So you can hit Layers and it brings back layers. Aside from that, we'll go ahead and open up Properties. And then we'll stack it so that it gives you a more comfortable workspace. Now the way you actually stack these is if you drag them over on top of each other, you'll see a blue line which indicates exactly where they're going to stack. So if you pull it apart and bring it next to each other, you'll see a blue line indicating where it's going to stack next to each other. So I can take it apart and then put it on top again. Now, the one other thing that I want to mention is if you look at my canvas at the moment, it may be black or it may be white depending on whatever default settings you have. However, in the background, you see this gray border. If you're using a Mac, it might not be there, or it may be there, just depending on what version you have. And you can double check that by going to Window and Application Frame. And as you notice, this may be a view that you may be accustomed to. The reason application frame exists is so that it basically gives you a good, clean environment to work in so that there's no clutter in the background. Secondly, if you have it disabled, what happens is if you click on your background, Photoshop disappears and you have to go back into Photoshop every single time, which is kind of a nuisance. So I'm going to click on application frame and keep my working environment very clean. The other thing to note is that if you right click on the border, you'll see different color options. So you can change it from medium gray to light gray, just depending on whatever environment you're most comfortable with. Or maybe even your output. Say you're working on something that requires a white background, say, for example, your website. You can change it so that instead of having light gray, you can have a custom color. You can select the custom color to white. And that way, whatever your document is, if it's a picture, or if you're just drawing something, you can change your background color. For now, we'll keep it to medium gray. So say you have a workspace that you're happy with. You can actually save the workspace by going under this tab here on the top right, and then say New Workspace. And you can name it to whatever you want. So we'll name it to RGG Workspace 101, and then hit Save. So if you, say, for example, are also a graphic designer and you have other uses for different palettes, you can keep those open and save them as a specific workspace as well. And the tools work the same way. These tools here, which we're going to get into, also come apart, and you can stack them. So it makes it relatively pretty simple to get started. The only thing you really need open are right now your layers, properties, tools, and if you want to bring them back again, go under Window and access the ones that you want. So in this section, we talked about getting used to Photoshop, getting acquainted with the welcome screen, and getting an idea of what the properties do and palettes. So for example, if you're a photographer and you have different uses for different palettes, you can move them to different screens. Or for example, if you're a retoucher like me and you have only need for certain palettes, you can customize it to the way that you want to. In the next section, we're going to talk about general preferences to help you maximize the workflow of Photoshop.